Doing well. Sorry about the hat. I just woke up. My hair is bad. Today we are continuing Unit 7. We're looking at post-World War I tensions, just some of the stuff that we didn't talk about in our previous lessons. So we focused pretty heavily on fascism in our last few days in the classroom. But when it comes to the rise of fascism and that sort of thing, we're going to zoom out from that a bit to see some of the other things that are going on in the world. A lot of this stuff is going to be seeds that are going to be planted today, but they're going to kind of flower. I've been inside too long. I'm thinking of gardening. They're going to kind of flower in our next unit with decolonization. There's some other stuff that's just kind of long-lasting, like a gloomy overhang in the attitudes of the rest of the 20th century. Let's roll on. Okay, so we briefly mentioned native resistance to colonialism and imperialism, as well as a few, in some readings, a few nascent independence movements. But World War I really poured gasoline on that fire, and it's not hard to see why. You look at these troops, Senegalese soldiers from the French. These guys were fighting for empires that had taken their homelands and now said, hey, go fight for us. And they figured logically, well, we fought, we bled, several of us died. We should be compensated for this. It's worthy to remember, y'all, India lost more soldiers in World War I than the United States did, but nobody talks about that. So just keep that sort of thing in mind. The other thing is the 14 points, President Wilson's plan for peace after the war, gave these colonies hope that they were going to be granted self-determination. Self-determination is one of those words you must know. If you are annotating these, that's one of those things you do have to have. So self-determination, it turned out, was one of those some exclusions apply, results may vary things. Wilson, to his credit, probably meant for it to apply more globally than it was actually implemented. There's some controversy there. Wilson was a remarkably racist individual, even for the early 20th century. But as it turned out, it didn't matter whether he wanted it only for white Europeans or for a global thing, because it wound up only for white Europeans. Non-whites were pretty much told to get back in line. Unsurprisingly, you see protests throughout the world in response to this. India, China. What you see here is a picture of some Vietnamese who came to talk about Vietnamese and Indo-Chinese independence. That guy standing in the middle, that's Ho Chi Minh, the father of Vietnam. He went to Paris to ask for Vietnamese independence. And these independence movements are usually this combination of educated individuals, such as Ho Chi Minh, as well as veterans who had fought and bled and who wanted the Europeans and the U.S. to live up to their rhetoric. There's an elephant in the room. I'll tell the story quickly because I'm kind of trying to go through these slideshows fast. I got a lot of recording to do today. But like Japan, the one major independent non-white combatant in the war on the Allied side, the Ottomans, of course, were defeated. The Japanese actually wanted a racial equality clause in the Treaty of Versailles, and Britain specifically said no because that would mean they would have to acknowledge the equality of their African and, most importantly for British, Indian subjects. So unfortunately, what happened to the colonies is what you would have figured. They were pretty much patted on the head and told to go back to being submissive. One of the areas largest, or with the largest impact that the war had, was in the Middle East, where the Arab population of the region, which made up huge swaths of different nations, was promised independence after the war was over so that they would support the British. If you've ever read or heard about Lawrence of Arabia, he was instrumental in that, helping lead though he was by no means the instigator of it, a rebellion of Arabs against the Turkish Ottomans. Those promises were pretty much immediately ignored, and the Middle East was carved up by the British and the French into what are called mandates. Not quite colonies, they were never officially a part of the French or British Empire, but they were pretty much under the thumb of those nations who would use their militaries to force people to obey. Now, you may be looking at the map and going, hey, wait a minute, I see Arabia's independent. Doesn't that mean Arab independence? Not really. Please remember, everything on that map that's west of Iran and south of Turkey, most of those places are ethnically majority Arab. There are pockets of other ethnicities. The Middle East is complicated, but as a general rule, Arabs are a large swath of that population, and large numbers of those Arabs did not gain true independence. Britain poured some fuel on the fire in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, which created or argued in favor of creating a homeland for the Jews in Palestine, which did have a sizable Jewish population, but also had a sizable Muslim population, and they don't like each other for a lot of different reasons. You also have to remember there, like I said, are other ethnic groups. There's an ethnic group that lives partially in modern Iraq, partially in modern Syria, partially in modern Turkey, called the Kurds. The Kurds wound up divided amongst all these little mandates. My head's blocking my caption there, but what happens is you have ethnic groups that don't much care for each other, arbitrarily placed in the same nation, and it works as well here as it did in sub-Saharan Africa. In Europe, a lot of new nations are created. You can pause and view the maps and check those. Not too much to say other than that here. These are the new countries created by these treaties after the war. And one of those things that people are arguing over the relevance of currently that I'm not going to get into, but you do need to know that right as the war ended, an extremely potent strain of flu became found throughout the soldiers fighting on the Western Front, and they were the flu rose at a very bad time because when the war ended, they went home and they took the flu with them as some sort of nightmarish souvenir. The pandemic, it's estimated, infected somewhere in the ballpark of 25% of the global population, with between 17, the low estimate, and 100 million, the high estimate, killed by this. Thing is, that's really difficult to estimate. You can find people arguing online over that, especially now that we have a pandemic going on all over. I would not go too far into the weeds with that, guys. Just know that despite its deadliness, the flu pandemic was largely forgotten. We barely talked about it in school when I was in high school. I bet your parents would tell you something very similar. And honestly, it tends to just crop up whenever there's a major outbreak of disease. We'll actually talk more about that in Unit 9 and objectives. We'll actually talk about the flu pandemic more in that one. Okay, so last but not least, and this is kind of a review of how things ended in our slideshow on the First World War, but probably the most important aspect of the war was psychological. Industry seemed to be solving so many problems, and it seemed to be producing such a good life that to have it all turn and go so wrong so violently with so many horrific injuries and so many people died for what seemed like no reason, and lest we forget the flu pandemic that I just mentioned that couldn't be solved with this new industrial medicine. It killed millions of people in this war that even a few short years after, people could see storm clouds gathering for a second, larger one coming. And a gloomy attitude settled over a lot of people. Not everyone, in some places not even the majority, lest we forget the roaring 20s of the Americas, but even then, guys like Hemingway, guys like Fitzgerald, they were cynical. They did not have this vision of a bright future, and we still see that today. This is an excerpt from a poem you guys are doing in our enrichment activity for this. One of my favorites, The Hollow Men by T.S. Eliot. Apologies to my fifth period who've read it. Tried to keep this under 10 minutes, failed, but only slightly, so good job, me. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you again next time.